Today I'm going to be talking about the scene subculture, otherwise known as neon emo on cocaine. It was a pretty little thing that existed in the wildlands of earlier this decade and in the late 2000s. For what it was, it did get pretty popular despite how weird it is, and it even had a nice impact on mainstream culture at the time. I started researching this topic mostly because I was sort of subconsciously, a scene kid back in my 2012-2013 middle school years, and what bothered me the most about this whole subject is how it died so quickly and left really little to no traces. After thinking it through, I think I might have an answer as to why is that, which I'll talk about later. But before that, here's a brief history on the scene subculture. Although they are really different, I can't really talk about scene without mentioning emo. Back in the early to mid 2000s, emo started becoming popular, with bands like Taking Back Sunday, Brand New, and Thursday making albums that will eventually become beloved classics. Emo music at the time was a high-energy, emotional, somewhat dark, and occasionally aggressive form of punk rock. The image it had was not far from that. This started to change around the mid-2000s when bands associated with the emo subculture started putting out records that were far less dark and fit more into pop standards. Examples of some of these bands are Paramore, Panic at the Disco, Fall Out Boy, and the All American Rejects. These bands were associated for different reasons with the emo subculture, but their music was usually closer to pop punk or pop rock than emo. These bands hit the mainstream way harder than the older wave, and it really affected the overall image emo had as a result. That was the start of what is known today as MySpace emo, a subculture defined by pop-punk music, use of sites like MySpace obviously, and a moody attitude. – 2007 was pretty much the tipping point and sort of the birth year of scene subculture in my opinion. The MySpace emo wave was getting more and more popular, but what's really interesting was something that was going on elsewhere entirely. We'll have to rewind a bit for that. Back in the early to mid 2000s, the metalcore scene was gaining reasonable popularity due to acts that made it accessible to mainstream audiences, like Killswitch Engage, Bullet for My Valentine, and Avenged Sevenfold. This was something unique and special because metalcore is an extreme type of music, and having that type of music get mainstream attention is rare. Alongside metalcore, post-hardcore also started getting mainstream popularity, with acts like Silverstein, The Fall of Troy, and The Used. Now, this is completely my guess and I can't prove it, but I think it makes sense. Metalcore and post-hardcore became more marketable to mainstream audiences at the same time as MySpace emo's mainstream breakthrough, and considering how both genres have a reputation for being edgy and alternative, it's only natural that fans on both sides of the fence would get interested in each other and mix. That mix between fans of MySpace emo and the core fans is in my opinion what initially sparked the scene subculture. It obviously grew and became more than just that, but that was the start of it. In 2008, the scene really took the shape that we know today. Music that was pretty much made for scene kids by scene kids started coming out, and there was a lot of experimentation going on. In this year, a new music genre was born, and it's currently the only one that is almost exclusively defined as a scene music genre. It's called crunkcore, basically a mix between screamo, electropop, and crunk. Just in case you haven't heard of it, crunk is a type of hip-hop music meant for parties. Usually it features loud, danceable hip-hop beats, aggressive shouted vocals, and simple lyrics. Crunkcore was pretty much the only sort of maybe original thing you can say the scene subculture created. At the front of it were a group called Broken Side, and there were also a few others like Blood on the Dance Floor and Dot Dot Curve. I'm actually really surprised crunkcore got any popularity whatsoever, because it literally sounds like trash 100% of the time. Crunk is a questionable genre as it is, but adding terrible screaming and MySpace aesthetics really doesn't do it any good. Why should I explain it to you when I can literally show you God's mistake right here?
1, 2, alright. like this. One, two, we got it for you. 3, 4, lock your door. 5, 6, suck on my dick. We'll get started, we'll never die. Got a monster in my pants, and if you ever get the chance, gonna cram it down your throat. What you guys are airing choke. I'm gonna jizz all in your face. I'm gonna wreck this fucking place. Pull my hair, smash and tear. Wake the bed and give me
2008 to 2010 were big years for the scene subculture, and the point where it started to get pretty big. A lot of new releases came around and a lot of new groups too. Some notable releases from around this time are I'm Not a Fan But the Kids Like It by Broken Side, Someday Came Suddenly by Attack Attack, Selfish Machines by Pierce the Veil, Epic by Blood on the Dance Floor, Once by 303, and Homesick by A Day to Remember. Great album, by the way. I don't know if you remember, but around 2007 to 2013, pop culture had a lot of party hard attitude. You had edgy teen comedy movies like Superbad and 21 Jump Street. In music you had EDM, crunk and other types of party music getting popular. Raves, loud electronic music, Monster Energy, alcohol obviously, you know the deal. I think part of the reason the scene subculture became popular is that it fit in sort of with a lot of the pop culture image at the time. Sure, some artists and bands had a level of seriousness, I guess, in them, but a lot of it was dumb fun and parties. In the end, I think the scene subculture didn't only fit in, but stood out in many ways and influenced pop culture to some extent at least. I guess now it's inevitable to start talking about how things actually went wrong. Here's a Google Trends graph that'll help us see the interest in the scene subculture over time. We can see that around 2007 interest starts to go up. From mid-2008 to mid-2010 we're seeing some very high interest and we reach some massive peaks. After that interest starts cooling off but stays somewhat stable for 2011 and 2012. Around the beginning of 2013 we see a permanent decline which the scene subculture just does not recover from. Just to put into perspective how big this was, here's a Google Trends graph comparing alternative rock to scene. There was a time when the scene subculture was literally more popular than alternative rock. Before you say this isn't impressive, remember how weird and extreme this subculture is. This is really insane. Data shows that scene was also more popular than crunk and pop punk. Now let's talk about the fall. As I mentioned, around 2013 the scene subculture entered a permanent state of decline, and a very severe decline at that. Scene music just stopped being made. Everyone who did make it before just stopped doing it, or did other things, or stopped being associated with the scene subculture for some reason. I don't know. It was a pretty big thing and had a longer lifespan than you would anticipate from just another fad. You might think it's the same thing that happened to emo, but it's really not. There are still people today who make emo music and have strong underground popularity. You can still see emo influence mainstream culture and music to some extent. It might not be what it used to be, but it's not dead by any means. Now, let's review what we know. The scene subculture originally started around 2007 as some sort of mix or fusion between MySpace emo and the core subculture, but developed its own aesthetic and sound in time. The scene subculture isn't defined by a specific style of music but by many, like crunkcore, core, MySpace emo, electropop, EDM, and others. Crunkcore is the only style of music you can argue is completely scene. The scene subculture fit in with the pop culture image and trends from its time, which helped it become more popular. The scene subculture had pretty significant popularity around 2008 to 2012, but entered a permanent decline around 2013. With that out of the way, let's get to my theory on the fall of the scene subculture. Remember that this is my subjective opinion. I'll try to back it up as best I can, but it is an opinion. I think one critical flaw that the scene subculture had is that it didn't really have an identity. It's a subculture that sort of presents itself as if it's centered around music, but the type of music associated with it is pretty broad compared to other subcultures like it. Scene music can be basically anything scene kids want scene music to be. Deathcore, electropop, crunk, dubstep, even glam rock, hair metal type bands are associated with it. Crunkcore, the only type of music that is 100% scene, doesn't even have a stable definition of what it is. It's supposed to be crunk music with screaming, but a lot of the groups labeled crunkcore don't even use screaming. Some of them are barely crunk at all as it is. You can say that the scene is not about music, but about fashion, aesthetic, and mindset, but these things are an issue of their own. Scene fashion is usually pretty close to MySpace emo fashion, and that's why people confuse the two so much. The mindset is the same as what was in at the time, and that's not special anyway. It's sort of like the scene subculture was a passenger in a car driven by others, and when these drivers started disappearing or getting tired, no one in the scene subculture knew how to drive a car. So when the scene subculture got to a point where it can't ride on the backs of others anymore, it just sort of faded. Bands and artists that made music that is clearly influenced by scene aesthetics usually just started doing other things. The crunkcore and other clearly scene artists also started doing other things, but faded into obscurity when everyone else stopped caring. The scene subculture is probably the first significant subculture that owes a thank you to the internet for a lot of its popularity, and that's one of the things that made it special to me. To think something started by a bunch of kids on MySpace would get this far, that's pretty amazing if you ask me. But it flew too close to the sun, it got very popular very fast, and it didn't have a lot of original ideas to offer. Although scene music is pretty bad most of the time, I still have a weird fondness to it. I know it's not nostalgia because I didn't really listen to any of this when I was younger, but it still makes me feel nostalgic and remember a different time, and that can't be bad, right? So, in this last part I want to tie some loose ends. It's going to be a bit of rapid fire, but I'll try to make it bearable. First, I know that some people will claim that the scene subculture never died. People still do make metalcore music and all that stuff, and it has some popularity. I've heard some people just consider emo rap and all that stuff the new scene. Again, the scene subculture always had a shaky, very broad identity, so considering things seen now is just kind of pointless to some extent. Even if there is a subculture around these things, it's not what it was back then, maybe influenced by it at best. Regarding the future, I've seen some people on Twitter talk about a scene revival. Also a few months ago, Finn McKenty from the Punk Rock NBA made a video predicting a scene revival this year. I think the revival he sees is possible, but it's again not really what the scene originally was. Finn said in this video himself that this revival will most likely be a thing for elitists and snobs, and not the edgy MySpace teenager thing it used to be, and I think I agree. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. I worked pretty hard on it, I think, so I'll be glad to hear your thoughts. I might be wrong about things I said here, and I'm open for new ideas too. This is the first video in a series I'm planning, so stay tuned for new videos. And also remember to check the description of this video for clarifications and more info. I was Eden, not aiming for the truck, and have a nice day.